The alarm did not scream. It just clicked on, calm and steady, like it already knew we had no reason to panic. I was standing on the bridge of a small research ship called the Halcyon Drift, 3 weeks out from Mars, when the sensors caught something that should not have existed. A fleet, not a probe, not a drone, not a stray comet with a strange shine. A fleet of ships, arranged in a pattern too perfect to be natural, sitting quietly at the edge of our solar system like they had been waiting for us to notice them. My name is Ellen Marsh. I was the ship's communications officer, which meant that when the universe decided to say hello, I was the one who had to answer. The ships did not fire. They did not move. They simply opened a channel, and a voice came through that sounded like it was reading from a script it had used 1,000 times before. Species designated human. You have been found in violation of galactic growth limits. Compliance is required. Resistance is inefficient. I remember laughing, not because it was funny, but because my brain did not know what else to do with a sentence like that. Captain Daniel Cole, a quiet man who rarely raised his voice, walked up beside me and asked for the translation twice, just to be sure he had heard it right. When I confirmed it, he did not look afraid. He looked annoyed, the way you look when a stranger tells you how to park your own car. "Tell them we need time to consult our leadership," he said. I sent the message. The reply came back in less than 4 seconds. "You have 1 hour." That was the moment I understood we were not being greeted. We were being given an ultimatum. Within minutes, Earth's deep space relay picked up the same message being broadcast to every human colony, every mining station, every research post scattered across our small corner of the galaxy. And within minutes after that, something strange happened. Nobody panicked. I watched grown men and women, scientists and pilots and engineers, put down their tools, look at their screens, and simply start working faster. It was Daniel who said it best, later that day, when I asked him why nobody was screaming. "We've had worse mornings," he said. "We just didn't know the enemy's name yet." He was right. Humanity had spent its whole history rehearsing for disaster. Storms, wars, disease, hunger. We were not new to fear. We were only new to this particular shape of it. The reply Earth sent back 1 hour later was short. It did not beg. It did not threaten. It simply said, "We decline." 2 words. That was our answer to an ultimatum from a civilization that had existed for 10,000 years. The alien fleet did not wait for a counteroffer. Within 3 days, ships began entering our system from multiple directions, spreading out like they were used to conquering, not negotiating. Colonies on the edge of our reach, small mining posts and research stations, were the first to feel their presence. Not attacked yet, just surrounded, like a hand slowly closing around something small. I was reassigned from the Halcyon Drift to Earth's Central Command Center in orbit, a station called Meridian, because someone up the chain decided that whoever heard the aliens speak first should be close to whoever had to answer them. That is how I ended up standing behind Admiral Grace Holloway, a woman with silver hair and a voice like a closing door, watching a wall of screens fill with red markers that represented an enemy fleet larger than anything we had ever built. "They think we'll break," Grace said, mostly to herself. "They've done this before, to someone else. And it worked." "How do you know?" I asked. She tapped a folder that had just come through on a secure channel from a source none of us fully understood yet. Inside were translated fragments, pieces of history recovered from a captured data drone that had drifted too close to one of our outposts and been pulled in by curious engineers. The fragments told us about a galactic alliance called the Concord, a group of species that had kept peace among themselves for thousands of years, by making sure no new species ever grew strong enough to challenge them. Whenever a young civilization showed signs of expanding too quickly, the Concord would strike first, cripple their growth, and fold them into obedience before they became a threat. It was not war to them. It was maintenance. "They're not trying to destroy us," Grace said. "They're trying to tame us." "That's almost worse," I said. She almost smiled. "Good. Let's make sure it feels that way to them too." I did not understand yet how deep her calm went, until 3 days later when the first shots were fired, not by us, but by them, against a small research outpost near Europa. The outpost had no weapons capable of real defense. It had scientists, families, and 24 engineers studying ice formations under Jupiter's moon. They fired anyway. A warning, they called it. A message about compliance. 12 people did not make it. I remember the names being read aloud during a short, quiet gathering on Meridian Station, and I remember that nobody cried loudly. There was grief, real and heavy, but it moved through the room like a tide, not a storm. It left behind something harder than sadness. That night, Daniel found me staring at the screen where the outpost's last transmission still played on loop. A young engineer named Peter Lang, calmly reading out coordinates and radiation levels even as the walls around him were failing, because someone needed the data and he was not going to let fear stop him from sending it. They wanted us to break, Daniel said quietly. Instead, we got a data report. I laughed, and then I cried, and then I went back to work, because that is what everyone else was doing too. The Concorde expected surrender. What they received was mobilization. Within a week, every shipyard on Earth and Mars and the outer colonies was running at full capacity. Civilian freighters were retrofitted with makeshift defenses. Retired pilots came out of retirement. Teenagers who had only ever flown simulators were given real controls, because there was no time to wait for a new generation to grow up properly, and because it turned out humans learn very quickly when the stakes are real. I was assigned to monitor communications during what would later be called the Meridian Standoff, the first real battle of the war, though at the time none of us knew it would be remembered that way. The Concorde sent a blockade fleet to surround a mining colony called New Harbor, expecting the colony to surrender within hours once its supply lines were cut. Instead, a woman named Claire Dunmore, a freighter pilot with no military training and a ship built for hauling ore, organized 20 other freighter pilots into a formation nobody in the Concorde fleet had ever seen before. They did not fight like soldiers. They flew like people who had spent their whole lives navigating storms, asteroid fields, and equipment failures with nothing but instinct and stubbornness. I listened to the recordings afterward, over and over, because I could not believe what I was hearing. Claire's voice, steady and almost bored, giving instructions to pilots who had never trained together. Cut engines on my mark, let them think we're drifting, then hit the gap between their third and fourth ship. They won't expect civilians to know their own formation has a weak point. It worked. The blockade broke, New Harbor held. When the recordings reached the Concorde command, according to the intercepted transmissions we later decoded, their officers debated for hours about how a group of untrained civilians had exploited a tactical weakness that took their own academies years to teach. One officer, whose voice appeared in later recordings, said something that stuck with all of us. They do not fight like a civilization, they fight like a family defending a house. That comment traveled through every human command center like a spark through dry grass. It became something soldiers whispered before battles, something engineers wrote on the sides of ships. We are a family defending a house. It was not a slogan someone invented. It was something an enemy said about us, and we decided to keep it. The war spread quickly after that. Battles happened at the edges of colonies, around resource stations, along the quiet corridors between planets where nothing had ever happened before. I moved between assignments, translating intercepted alien communications, watching patterns emerge in how they fought. The Concorde fought like an old, tired army managing a long-running conflict, careful, procedural, expecting their opponents to eventually run out of will. Humanity fought like something with nothing left to lose and everything left to protect. Every battle we won by refusing to follow the rules they expected us to follow. I remember one report, brought to Grace by a young officer named Nathan Price, describing a skirmish near Saturn's rings, where a group of engineers had modified old asteroid mining lasers, originally built for breaking up rock, into short-range defensive tools. Nobody had trained for that. Somebody just looked at the equipment they had and the threat in front of them and asked a simple question: what do we already own that could help? They innovate faster than any species we've fought before, Grace read aloud from a recovered Concorde report, her voice carrying a strange mixture of pride and worry. Their lack of formal doctrine appears to be their greatest strength. They think our chaos is a weapon, I said. It is, Grace replied. We just never called it that before. Months passed. The war did not end quickly, and it was not without cost. I lost people I had trained with. Daniel lost his younger brother, a pilot stationed near one of the outer colonies, though he only told me about it weeks later, in a quiet moment between shifts, his voice steady even as his hands were not. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't hurt, he said, but hurting doesn't mean stopping. That sentence became something I repeated to myself more times than I could count. The turning point of the war came almost a year after that first ultimatum, near a place we started calling the Bridge, a cluster of asteroid stations that connected several of our outer colonies. The Concorde sent one of their largest fleets yet, led by a commander whose name we later learned was Vesic, an alien officer whose voice carried a strange, tired patience that reminded me of someone who had done this exact job for a very long time and hoped, quietly, that it would finally work this time. Vesic's fleet was meant to crush the bridge entirely, ending our ability to move ships and supplies between colonies. If it fell, we would be cut off, isolated, and eventually forced into the surrender the Concorde had wanted from the very beginning. I was on Meridian Station when the battle began, watching through a combination of sensor feeds and intercepted communications as our combined fleet, military ships alongside converted freighters and civilian volunteers, met Vesek's forces at the edge of the asteroid cluster. The battle lasted 6 hours. I will not pretend it was simple or clean. Ships were lost on both sides. Communications crackled with names of people who did not make it through, read out steadily by officers whose voices shook but never stopped. Grief moved through the command center like it always did, quiet and heavy, but never once did it turn into panic. What turned the battle was not a new weapon or a hidden trick. It was something simpler. Our forces, spread across dozens of small ships instead of a few large ones, refused to fight the way Vesek's fleet expected. Instead of retreating when pressed, smaller groups would scatter, regroup, and strike from different directions, forcing the Concorde fleet to divide its attention across a battlefield that kept reshaping itself faster than their command structure could respond to. Near the end of those 6 hours, Vesek's flagship found itself isolated, surrounded not by our largest warships, but by a loose formation of freighters and small fighters, the same kind of ships the Concorde had once considered too weak to matter. I listened as the final exchange between Vesek and our fleet commander, a woman named Laura Bennett, came through on an open channel that somehow both sides chose to keep unblocked, perhaps because both of them wanted to be understood in that moment. "Your fleet is beaten," Laura said. "You have a choice. Surrender your ship, and its crew will be treated fairly. Or continue, and we will finish this the hard way." There was a long pause before Vesek answered, his voice slower than I had heard from any Concorde officer before. "Your species does not fight like anything my people have studied. You fight without doctrine, without hesitation, and without fear of loss. How does a species survive long enough to reach the stars while fighting this way?" Laura's answer was simple, almost gentle, and it was the answer that ended up being repeated across every human colony within days. "We didn't survive by avoiding fear. We survived by refusing to let it decide anything for us." Vesek surrendered his ship, not because he had no other option in that exact moment, but because, according to records recovered later, he had already begun questioning whether the Concorde's entire strategy toward humanity had been built on a mistaken assumption from the very beginning. The victory at the bridge did not end the war immediately, but it changed its shape completely. Word spread through the Concorde's own ranks, not just about the battle itself, but about what happened afterward, when Laura's fleet chose to treat Vesek's surrendered crew with basic decency, instead of using their victory as an excuse for cruelty. Other alien species within the Concorde, ones who had been forced into obedience long before humanity ever reached the stars, began reaching out quietly through channels the Concorde's leadership could not fully monitor. Some offered information, some offered support. All of them seemed to be asking the same quiet question underneath their words. Is it finally possible to stop being afraid of them too? I was present, months later, when the first formal peace negotiations began aboard a neutral station positioned between our territory and conquered space. Grace led our delegation, with Laura and Daniel standing beside her, and I served once again as a translator, though by then our own linguists had improved enough that my role was smaller than it once had been. The Concorde's representatives arrived expecting to negotiate limits on human expansion, the same demand they had opened with over a year earlier. What they found instead was a delegation offering something they clearly had not prepared for. "We are not asking to be left alone," Grace said, her voice calm and even. "We are asking to be treated as equals. You tried to remove that choice from us. It did not work. We would prefer not to spend the next 10,000 years proving that point again." There was a long silence in the room. I watched the Concorde representatives, several species I still did not fully understand, exchange glances that carried more uncertainty than I had ever seen from them before. The peace that followed was not perfect. No war ends cleanly, and no agreement satisfies everyone completely. But humanity was no longer treated as a problem to be managed. We had a seat at the table, earned not through negotiation alone, but through every battle where we refused to behave the way the Concorde expected a young, fragile species to behave. I returned to the Halcyon Drift almost 2 years after that first ultimatum, standing once again on its bridge, looking out at the same stars that had once carried an unwelcome fleet toward us. Daniel was still captain. Some of the crew had changed. Some names were now only remembered in quiet moments rather than spoken aloud. It was Daniel who asked me, one evening, why I thought we had managed to hold together the way we did, when every alien strategist studying us seemed to expect us to collapse. I thought about Peter Lang reading out data as his outpost failed around him. I thought about Claire Dunmore flying freighters into a blockade with nothing but instinct and stubborn confidence. I thought about Laura Bennett's quiet answer to Vesic, an answer that ended up changing the direction of an entire war. I think we never had the luxury of being afraid without also being useful, I said. So somewhere along the way, we just stopped separating the two. Daniel nodded slowly, looking out at the stars the way you look at something familiar that has just become a little less frightening. Somewhere beyond our sensors, the galaxy that had once judged us a threat to be contained was still adjusting to a simple, unavoidable truth. They had chosen war, expecting hesitation, panic, and eventual surrender. Humanity had simply gotten to work instead. And in the quiet space between one star and the next, I understood that this was the real answer to Vesic's question, the one none of us had needed to speak aloud, because by then, the entire galaxy had already seen it for themselves. We did not flinch, not because we were fearless, but because somewhere in our long, difficult history, we had already learned that fear and effort could exist in the same breath, and that the second one always outlasted the first.